So welcome to part 2 in this series of videos, and in the second part we're going to discuss modifying the power supply. Now I'm assuming, and if you haven't done so, I would highly recommend that you watch the first video in the series because it discusses how we got to this point and how we get to the power supply inside this old G5 case. So there are two reasons why we need to upgrade this power supply. One, those cables are too short, the connectors are different, and the power rating is just not enough to do what we're going to do. Now, it's true that in the previous video I mentioned that the older CPUs, they use a lot more power than the modern CPUs. However, modern graphics cards are far more powerful than the graphics cards in older computers, and so we're definitely going to need to upgrade the power supply. Besides, you wouldn't want to convert your machine and have this nice graphics workstation using a 10 or 15-year-old power supply. So it makes sense to upgrade to a new power supply. So here's the power supply I got for this build. And bear in mind that in order for a power supply to work with your conversion, it has to be a standard ATX power supply. However, bearing in mind that we will not be installing the power supply as is, rather we'll be transferring the parts from this brand new power supply to the old power supply case, then you have to make sure that it's not a modular power supply. All the cables have to come pre-connected to the power supply with a standard color coding. That's very important. And the other thing you also want to bear in mind is that before you start transferring parts, you need to test the power supply, because once you open that case, once you break that sticker on the power supply, you've basically voided the warranty. So even though you're buying a reputable power supply, test it before you start transferring the parts to the old power supply case. And we're going to talk about testing right now. Okay, so this is your standard ATX power supply tester that you can purchase for less than 20 bucks online. And to the right is where you would connect the 24-pin connector for the motherboard. And usually once you connect that, it automatically powers on. And then to the left, then you can test other connectors, the standard connectors that come with an ATX power supply. And then on these adjacent sides, then that's where you would test your SATA or SATA connections. Now you might decide that, hey, I don't want to go through the expense of buying a power supply tester because it's not like I work on PCs every day and I need to test power supplies. So in order to avoid that expense, there's a cheaper way you could go about doing it. If you have all your hardware already, like your motherboard and so on, primarily your motherboard and your CPU, then you could just go ahead, connect the ATX connector to your motherboard, and then just press the button, the start button on your motherboard, or short out the pins to turn the power supply on, and that's a simple way of confirming that it's working. Another way you could do that is by just using a paper clip, and here's how you use a paper clip. On the power supply connector, notice this green pin right here. That green pin is pin number 16, and make sure that the connector is oriented so that this clip is facing you, and so this pin would be pin 16, and it's the only green pin inside that connector. And the reason why I mentioned the pin number is that some power supplies, they don't have the color coding. All the wires are the same color, but if you have the pin facing you, then the row furthest away from you, or I should say further away from you, is the first row, and the first pin would be number 1, the last one would be 12, and then on the nearer row, that's right beside where the pin is, then the fourth one from the corner would be pin number 16. Now I did do a video of me disassembling the old power supply, but I have no idea what happened to those videos. So here we're going to pick up with me placing the circuit board from the new power supply inside the case for the old power supply. These 60mm fans go to the front of the power supply. I ordered those easily off Amazon, and like I mentioned before, you'd never want to reuse old fans, especially fans that are more than 3 or 5 years old. Let's just get brand new fans and just get everything working right from the get-go. Now I was able to line up one of the screw holes on the new power supply circuit board to this hole right here, but obviously the other holes were never going to line up, so I had to use a piece of plexiglass to create a base, so to speak, to mount the other screw and just keep that circuit board stable. Now this glue that I'm using is very strong. However, you have to leave it overnight for it to dry properly. And having done this, I just put some weight on top just to make sure that it was a tight fit. And then the following day, I would be able to start working again. So here we are back the next day. Everything is dry. Now we can secure the plexiglass in the power supply's case so that the glue doesn't have to do all the work. And for this, I'll just drill a tiny hole, slightly smaller than the screw, and then drive the screw in. Of course, during that process, I also mounted the power supply board. Now, the original wires that go from the power socket to the power supply board were adequate for a 450 watt power supply. But for a 700 watt power supply, they were not going to work. Even a good conductor like copper offers some resistance to electron flow, and this resistance manifests itself as heat. If the wire is an inadequate size, then it will simply get warm. But if it is too thin, then it will get hot and melt the insulation on the wire. If both wires lose their insulation, then they will short out and cause a fire, and that's something we definitely want to avoid. So let's go with thicker wire. Also, you want to make note of which color wire goes where, especially the black and white wires. Black is hot or live and white is neutral. Don't try to desolder the existing wires, just cut off the portion that is not soldered. The original solder requires very high temperatures to melt, so I decided to work on the connection for the cooling fans, since the new solder requires lower temperatures, and that would give my soldering iron some additional time to reach the high temperatures needed for working on the power socket. Now, when you do your power supply, you don't have to use the fancy connectors and a circuit board as I'm doing here. You could simply pigtail the wires together with a wire nut, but since the fans came with the connectors already crimped to the wire, I decided to use them. After soldering the connections, I then used some silicone or hot glue to hold the wires in place and prevent them from working loose over time. Here you can see I've already replaced a thin black wire in the power socket with a thicker gauge wire, and now I'm doing the white or neutral wire. For those of you who are studying electrical or electronics engineering, remember to always tin the wire first. Tinning is the process of putting solder on the section of the wire you plan to solder first, and then joining it to the connection, which should also have solder placed on it, prior to you joining both pieces together. Now this device here is a ferrite core, and its purpose is to prevent electromagnetic interference from passing through to the power supply circuit board. Because these wires are thicker, I can't pass both wires through it as was the case with the previous wires, so I decided to wrap only the live wire through the ferrite core. That should be fine because the neutral wire is bonded to ground anyway, and stray signals getting onto the neutral wire should immediately be shunted to ground. Of course, once I'm done testing, I tape the connection for security, and I use my voltmeter to make sure that there are no shorted connections. With the socket mounted, I can now connect the wires to the leads on the power supply board, and after twisting them together, I use heat-activated shrink tubes to hold the connections in place. It's also a good idea to secure your cables in place. Make sure that when the cover for the power supply goes on, it does not touch any part of the circuit board or its components. So with all the 120 volt AC connections secured, I can now focus on the DC connections. Notice how I've kept the separation between the wires carrying the 120 volt in and the DC lines out, including those for the fans. So with all the connections made, I can do my first test and final placements before closing the case. Before putting on the cover, I'm going to have to widen this hole so that all the cables can pass through. Forgive the mess in the background, but we seized the opportunity to do some fall cleaning and get rid of some old stuff, which we were able to sell via an online garage sale. After cutting off the metal, it's important to use a grindstone and get rid of any sharp edges that could cut you or cut the cables. And even though I made the edges of the hole smooth with my grindstone, I'm taking the added precaution of covering it with metallic tape. I realized at the end that I had connected the ground wire to the wrong spot, so that I had to move. And with that complete, we can now close the case. As an added precaution, I sealed off this hole just to avoid the possibility of something falling inside and shorting a circuit. And with that complete, it's important to do one final test. Bear in mind that if you do not feel comfortable doing all this by yourself, check out the link in the description below, as there is someone on eBay who can upgrade your power supply for you and then send it back with a 2 to 3 day turnaround. Don't forget to add a sticker with the new power rating, because who knows, you might end up selling this computer and the new owner needs to know what he or she has.